Penance is not a world for anecdotes. It's a prison, a massive, decaying metallic sphere filled with the Imperium's dregs, heretics, murderers, traitors. Its gravity felt heavier than any world I'd known, crushing the soul before the chain gangs crushed the bone. And of course, the wardens. And you know who was worse than the inmates? The wardens. I was barely 23, fresh out of the Schola Progenium, full of ideals and regulations, armed with a bolt pistol and the Emperor's mandate. I was ready to instill discipline, but I was not ready for the sheer, grinding despair of a penal colony assigned to the absolute periphery of the sector. We were sent to escort reinforcements, 50 newly processed convicts, a common routine convoy mission. 4 weeks of hell in an overcrowded transport, stinking of recycled air, fear, and sweat. When we finally dropped anchor, the sight of Penance itself was a warning. Kilometers of rusty barracks stretched into the smog, framed by colossal leaning concrete walls and watchtowers whose automated weaponry looked like skeletal fingers pointing at a polluted orange-gray sky. I was supposed to stay for just a week, overseeing the integration of the new arrivals and checking the local administratum records. A week became a life sentence in my memory. That's when it started. The shift in atmosphere was palpable, like the static before a storm. At first, it looked like a standard disciplinary issue, perhaps an escape attempt gone awry. Sergeant Varakov, a fat, repulsive sadist who loved to accidentally withhold rations from the inmates, watching them starve with a greasy smile, simply vanished. My first thought was revenge. Inmates will be inmates. I doubled the patrols, declared the incident a mass escape attempt, and ordered the harshest possible treatment for any infraction just to reassert control. But 2 days later, we found Varakov, and it wasn't an escape. It was a performance, a calculated statement of intent. We discovered him in an old, abandoned boiler room, thick with the smell of scorched oil and stale steam. He was locked inside a massive, makeshift mechanical press, one of those ancient, terrifying industrial devices. Immobilized from the waist down by steel clamps, only his head and arms were free. Before him, on a rusty workbench, was an old Imperial chronometer. Its huge numerals glowed blood red. 2 minutes remained. Above him, etched crudely but precisely into the press's metal, was an inscription. A precise, almost calligraphic engraving. By the measure with which you have measured, it will be measured unto you, atonement for the sin of your gut. We burst in, and I saw his face. Not mere fear, hysteria. He was screaming, shaking, pleading, saliva flying. And right next to his flailing hand, on a chain that led nowhere he could reach, hung a gigantic empty sack of thick canvas and a crude scale large enough to hold half a ton. The meaning was brutal in its simplicity. To stop the press, he had to counterbalance the sack with a weight equal to all the rations he had stolen from his charges. The weight needed would have been impossible for a single man to procure, let alone lift, in the time given. He died a day later from shock after we finally deactivated the machine. The crushing wasn't fatal. The realization was. I knew immediately this wasn't an ordinary lunatic or a desperate convict. This was an entity that operated with chilling purpose. This was justice. Smena Kadra. The next day, I received the first formal report signed. Justice. It was a note written on stolen, high-quality parchment and slipped into my quarters. Just 2 words, chillingly simple. Toil purifies. The second victim was Corporal Selenko, a small, wiry bastard known for his creative sadism. He'd use heavy wrenches to knock out inmates' teeth and deliberately break their fingers for sport. We found him in an abandoned docking station, a cavernous, echoing chamber smelling of salt and decay. He was chained to the wall. Both his hands were locked inside massive, old, Imperial metal vices, thick and rusted, and a digital timer was counting down above him. Nearby, on an old workbench, lay a rusty but impeccably sharp, circular saw blade, hand-operated, meant for cutting heavy timber, and again the inscription, neatly spray-painted in black. Your hands sowed pain, now they must serve you for cleansing. Choose the lesser evil for your salvation. He had a choice, twisted as it was. He had to saw off one of his own hands to use its weight as a counter lever to release the vices from the other hand before the timer ran out and the crushing forces engaged. I watched his eyes dart desperately between the saw and the vices, calculating. He had perhaps 90 seconds left. I couldn't wait. My duty is order, not theological debate. We used massive bolt cutters, but the steel was ancient, hardened. The seconds bled away. I saw him screaming a high-pitched, desperate sound, grab the rusty saw, trying to brace it and cut off his own wrist. He screamed that justice had given him a choice, atone for his cruelty or die. He screamed that the terms were logical. We were 20 seconds too late. The vices engaged with a terrible, slow finality. We heard the crunch, even through the clamor and the heavy armor. When we finally freed him, Selenko was alive, barely, but his hands. When I looked at his face, I saw in his eyes not hatred toward his tormentor, but a profound, sickening understanding of his fate. That was infinitely worse than hatred. This wasn't heresy. It wasn't a demon. This was a perverted, monstrous parody of our own Imperial justice system. He forced men to pay the exact price for their sins. There was a chilling, absolute logic to his methods. Paranoia became endemic. The corrupt wardens and guards began voluntarily confessing to minor transgressions, petty theft, unnecessary brutality, to their superiors. They feared the traps of justice more than they feared the administratum, or even the Inquisition itself. I realized justice wasn't a desperate inmate. It was someone with access to the system, to the schematics, to the supplies, to the movements. It was one of us. The next trap was the biggest, intended for the chief warden, Colonel Artman. Artman was not just cruel, he was utterly corrupt. He sold entire transports of inmates into off-world slavery and took kickbacks from local smugglers. We cornered the scene in the primary sub-level power room. Artman was suspended by 10 thick chains over a gigantic open vat of boiling, corroding acid that bubbled menacingly. There were 10 chains, each connected to a separate manual lever. Beneath each chain stood one of his 10 deputies, all the men who knew about his illegal deals, his silent partners in crime. To save Artman, one of his deputies had to pull a lever. But the levers were unmarked, and they didn't know which one would hoist him to safety, and which 9 would simply sever their associated chain and drop him into the vat. This was the climax, the moment the system should have broken down entirely. Artman was screaming, pleading for loyalty. The deputies stood there, white with fear, looking at each other, paralyzed by self-preservation. This was anarchy. My regulation was clear, forged in the Progenium's fires. Order above all else. The Emperor does not need justice that leads to chaos. The Emperor needs obedience and control. I made my decision instantly. I didn't save Artman. I didn't attempt to deduce the maniac's identity. I ordered my men to open fire, not on the suspended target, on all 10 of Artman's deputies. The bolt rounds hit the 10 men simultaneously. As they collapsed, the sudden violent jerks on the taut chains caused the whole support structure to fail. The central chain snapped and Artman plunged. He didn't make it to the acid. He smashed against the steel grating below, lifeless. I stood there, my pistol smoking, and silence fell once again, heavier than ever. My actions stopped the justice but restored the order. I left penance 3 days later. My report was dry, filed in triplicate. Colonel Artman and 10 of his officers were executed for the heresy of corruption and conspiracy. Source of the disorder neutralized. Order restored. Sometimes our duty is not justice, it is control. I didn't give them a choice. I took it away. That was my verdict.